Hello again and welcome to my video on the basics of swordplay, an in-depth guide to the swords in Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. Now on the basis of kind of refreshing what Tomcat teaches you, and of course Tomcat is located outside the Nomad's camp and he's the one that kind of teaches you like the Master Strike and the combos and stuff that'll really make it easier for you in the beginning. The point of posting this is to kind of give you a refresher because you can pause right now and say, well, you know, this is what the game mechanic records or rewards, not records. And this is what the game kind of punishes, including things it talks about stamina, armor, and stat requirements, but that's just basic RPG stuff. But just for the idea that we're kind of harping back to what he teaches you in the beginning, that is why that's there. So my first tip is when you perform a quick riposte, don't force a direction change. This is simply saying when you perform a block and then you go to riposte the block with your own counterattack, do not force your right stick or whatever you're using on PC. I'm not sure what it is to pick a side. Do not force a direction change. The game kind of puts you where you need to go when it comes to riposting, and I really think it's not beneficial to force it as it will leave you open from the enemy's own attacks. Tip number 2 is don't get forced into perfect block riposte battles with enemies. This is a pretty simple tip, and honestly this tip is more so based in like the early game before you get your stats that kind of keep your stamina good. Is all it's gonna do when you get into these kind of like, you know, it's very kind of like cinematic battles where it's just clink, 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 clink. It's just going to drain your stamina. And at the end of the day, if you run out of stamina, you're kind of leaving yourself open to other things, like getting bonked in the head like I do at some point in this battle. Tip number 3 is don't fight the natural game mechanics. This kind of ties into the first one. An example would be combos naturally alternate sides. So if you start a combo on the left and then it's naturally going to go to the right, and then you have the choice to go up or down. One of the most overpowered concepts in the game is the 4-point combo, but the thing about it is you have to make it be natural. You can't force a right side combo and then in the same note try to force another right side attack and then go back to left. It should always be right, left, up, right, left, down. It should always have a natural flow to it. Don't make it be something it's not, because the game doesn't encourage that sort of, like, it wants you to follow the flow of combat. It doesn't want you to force anything. Tip 4, and this is really just a simple one, is dodging isn't really mentioned but briefly, but it is a lifesaver in tense situations. Press the same button as your jump to dodge while in combat. This one's pretty self-explanatory. I mean, if I'm being honest, and I'm 70 hours in, I didn't even use the dodge until some of the last parts of the game just because I didn't even know the thing. Maybe that's just me not paying attention, or maybe that's just the game showing you very briefly, but dodging is imperative when it comes to fighting some of those bigger groups that you face in the end game that will chase you down without any mercy. And it's kind of nice to have the ability to dodge without, it doesn't drain too much stamina, and it's very useful just kind of giving yourself a little bit of space away from some of the enemies in this game that honestly will chase you down without any sort of hesitation. So it's more so a way to position, which positioning in this game is king, so I think you should definitely dodge if you need to. Tip number 5 is always be the first one to strike. The emphasis on this idea is that it opens the enemy up to a master strike, as their sword will be opposite of where you are. So if I attack on the top, he's going to block me from the top as well, and then I'm going to be on the bottom prepared to master strike him while he's on the top still. Now we haven't talked about master strikes yet, as they kind of build into more like the advanced stuff, but we'll get into it in a second. Because honestly, the game is built on the idea that you're supposed to combo your stuff together in a way that makes it beneficial to you. Going back to the first couple tips we had about how the combos are important, you shouldn't just be spamming the same side every fight. Now, as we get into tip number 6, which I believe is the one about, so I guess we'll see in a second, but just remember what I'm saying about always you should be the one that starts the fights, and honestly that's the most important part because it opens you up to the next thing we're going to talk about, which is slash placement. Well, slash placement is very important in this game. Like, as you can see, and this is me fighting a pretty late game horde of enemies in a camp, you want to make it so you hit them in the head, especially if their head is bare. The same goes for Henry, though, where if I'm not wearing this helmet, which I am wearing a cool knight helmet in this scene, which I usually don't, Your head is always the most vulnerable part of your body. You can lose 70% of your HP from some of the later enemies with a single shot to the head, and vice versa to the enemies that you face. If you hit them in the head, 2 headshots is way more efficient than a couple body stabs. Just remember that. And honestly, it doesn't really emphasize this because the combos are the thing, but you are able to do what you want with your placement regardless of how you want to approach it. Now, just for the sake of continuity, headshots are king. Now, tip number 7 is the feint. Now, the feint is something that isn't really talked about, but it's very important. I would say, honestly, second only to the Master Strike itself. So what a feint is when you hold, because you can hold your attacks for a power move. What you're going to do is as you're releasing after holding your attack, obviously, so Henry's holding him in animation, as you're going to hit, you can change the direction where that hit is coming from last minute, and you will make it so that you land the hit in a different spot than the enemy is prepared for. It goes into the idea that we're countering them on their own terms. And then this ties into the Master Strike as well. The Master Strike is the most important ability in the game when it comes to sword wielders. How it works is if you're on the opposite side of the enemy you're facing, and you counter at the right time with your attack button, you can hit them with the Master Strike. The Master Strike is something that they cannot dodge once you have hit it, and it is honestly the coolest thing to pull off when you're fighting multiple enemies in your Master Strike, all of them. Master Striking along with feinting is honestly the 2 things that are most important, as it kind of encourages you comboing, but in a deceptive way. Like, oh, I want to hit a Master Strike, so I know I have to set up on the opposite side that they're set up at. Now, going into the next tip, of course, is poison. Poison, I will say I didn't really use poisons that much. I did only once or twice, but they still serve the purpose of buffing your sword to the point where it can be beneficial for you to use it against some of the harder enemies. Poisons, all it's doing is applying debuffs to the enemies, something that in a game like this, a big RPG, is honestly beneficial just based on the fact that debuffing your enemies is all you need to do to kind of succeed. Now, it ties into the idea that there's a ton of types. There's Widowmaker, there's the one whose name I forgot, something Death, and you can kind of search in your alchemy and find out which ones or buy them. Now, tying into the last tip is number 10. Number 10, I think, is the most important overall, besides being sort of a combat like person in this game, is you have to pick the abilities that kind of reflect what you want to do. In my own playthrough, for example, I am a Sword of Sir Valentine user, so that is single-handed. So most of the perks that I focused on early and mid and into the late game where it gets harder is that I picked perks that kind of complement my style. You should always be picking the perks of what you want to do. If you're a 2-handed person or a shielded person or a single-handed person, make sure you're picking the perks, because there's tons of perks that you unlock throughout. I unlocked so many throughout my 70-hour campaign journey. Pick the ones that are most important to what you're going to do. If you want to be a single-handed sword user that runs only a sword and no shield, run that. Pick the perks that matter for you. If you want to run a sword and shield, pick the perks that give you sword and shield stuff. There's plenty of perks that are put there to help you, and at the end of the day, you should build your character how you want to be built. This really goes into the idea that this game does force you to kind of read and pay attention to what you're doing. Of course, that's not a bad thing, but if you don't pick the things that you need to, it's just going to be detrimental to you. As always, I hope you all enjoyed.